Welcome to part 2 of this tutorial series where we're recreating Wanda's magic. And as I mentioned, we're going to create the tendrils now. And we're going to start by using the goal that we set earlier, because this is still going to be the core of all of our simulations, this sphere. And I'm going to just get a new stream here from this goal and scatter some points onto it. I'm going to go setting my visualization by right-clicking here to pixels. And I like turning off all acceleerations because this makes it just slower when you have a lot of particles, and usually it's not that useful for sims. And I'm going to start with 10,000 points. And next I'm going to create an attribute noise. As what we're trying to do is we're trying to isolate some points on the surface here. And we need the noise to isolate them in kind of an organic fashion. And let's just create this one, and again call it noise. I like using that name. And visualize it, and we want again it to be a lower element size, maybe 0.3, maybe 0.1. And let's start with that. We can change some more values later on. Let's just call it noise again. And let me just show you, if you do if at noise is less than 0.2, you don't need to do this. I'm just going to show an example of what this does, and then remove every other point. So I'm basically removing all the points that are, let's see, that are less than 0.2 on the noise. So 0 at ptnum. Let's see, it'll start removing patches of our particles here. However, this doesn't look like a string at all. This is just random patches. So in order to isolate it so that we can only remove them on kind of the edges of our noise, everything that's, say, between 0.5 and 0.6, and we can do that by using a fit function and a channel ramp. So if we set our color at CD equal to fit at noise, let's just use the 0.5 and 0.6 example, between 0 and 1. It will color everything under 0.5 to black and everything over 0.6 to 1, and in between it's going to be 0 to 1. But if we do another CD is equal to channel ramp, let's see, and I'm just going to remove this to be consistent, and I'm going to call this ramp and base that again on the CD. Then, well, on the CD is complicated because the CD is a vector, and I'm cheating a bit because I'm just assigning a float of vectors. I'm going to actually do this on just a noise, and then I'm going to create this noise up here by calling float noise, and then create the channel. We're just essentially doing the same. We're just making sure that it's a float being fed into the ramp instead of a vector. And now if I push this one to the middle and create a point here at the end, you'll see everything that's over 6 is 0, everything that's under, or everything that's over 0.6 is 0, everything that's under 0.5 is 0, but in between we get this nice line, which looks like string, especially if you boost up the total count a lot. And let's make some controls so we can adjust how wide this is and what part of the noise we're using. So I'm going to set a channel here called thresh, and then I'm going to set a channel here called, I'm going to use the same thresh. So if these are 0.5 or whatever I set this to, they'll both be like that. But then I'm going to set another channel adding on top of this maximum called width. So what that's going to do is I'm going to be able to set my thresh, and then I'm going to set the width after. So I can do the same 0.5, and a width of 0.1 is just going to be the same 0.5 and 0.6 that we had. But now I can choose how wide this one is, which is very useful. And this is a very nice little tool to create strings. And I'm actually going to keep it at 0.5 and set the width to 0.1018. So very thin strings, as they're going to diffuse a little bit in the actual simulation. And I'm also going to just set this a little bit lower. Actually, we can keep it like this. I think this will be good. Now let's name this wrangle string noise, as that's basically what it's doing. And we're also going to play around a little bit with the actual noise. But first, let's set the total count to 1,000,000, as that'll just give us easier shapes or cleaner shapes to work with. And I'm going to set the element size to 0.2 because I want some a bit larger shapes. And I'm going to animate it as well, which because then it'll move with time, and I'm going to set it pretty low because we want kind of a random string every frame. And next I'm also going to go into this fractal and lower the roughness, which will give us even cleaner shapes, because the shapes we want to be pretty clean. So maybe at around 0.4, just to smooth it out a little bit. And I'm also, I'm going to set the background to light, because you can see that there's a bunch of black particles here that we don't need. And if you just write if at CD is less than 0.2, so if the color value is less than 0.2, we're gonna use the function remove points, remove point 0 at ptnum. Ptnum stands for point num, or point number, which is just removing itself. And then we'll just be left with these stringy particles, which is very nice. And we don't want to emit on every frame of the sim. We just want this every so often. So I'm going to do another wrangle and call it set rand frame. And in here, I'm going to say, let's make this back to dark. If random at time, so this will be, you need capitalized T for this to work. So, or for this function to work, we need at time. Random at time will basically, every time there's a new frame, and this will even work for substeps since we're using the at time instead of at frame, it'll give us a value between 0 and 1. And we'll just say if this value is greater than some random threshold that we set, so channel, that is shorthand for thresh, and then we're going to remove the point. Every time it's greater than this, or every time the threshold is greater than this random number. So let's set this to say 0.3, and now 0.3 of the frames will have it visible, because 70% of the time it'll be this number will be greater than this threshold, so it'll be gone. But 0.3 of the times this thing will flicker. Well, it looks like a flicker now, but in the sim it just looks like it's going to emit every 0.3 or every 30% of the frames. And let's just set this to say 0.27, I think is a good number that I found. And something else we can do is, in this time, we can multiply this by channel seed. As long as this is over 0, this will allow us to change. If we find that in the simulation it's kind of emitting and sometimes we don't want, and it doesn't really work with maybe the performance of an actor or whatever plate you're using, then you can change this seed. Now let's set the velocity of these particles, and I'm going to do that by using the normals of this sphere, because we want it to go outwards, which the normals are already doing. So I'm going to create the normal and set the normals to points, so that we have, if you click here, you can see the point normals, and these will be carried through our scattered points here. And let's see, so we have them here, and if I create a wrangle and I set, I'm just going to call it set v, and at v is equal to at n, you can see we have the normals, or velocity pointing outwards from our normals. And then I'm going to create a rest attribute, because that's good to have after we do the simulation to add some noise after the fact. And now I'm going to create my pop network, which I'm going to call string particles popnet. And let's just jump in here on the first frame. And same deal here, I'm going to delete this merge and set this to all points, and we should be able to play, and you can see that it's firing off our points. But I'm gonna first, let's see, I'm gonna do an attribute delete, because I don't want to see this color. I just want them to always be white, or they're gonna be more of a yellowish hue. And I'm gonna set let's see, I'm gonna actually create pop wind with air resistance, because we don't want them to fly this far, but in pop wind there's already a base air resistance, which is already going to stop them from flying super far, but we can boost it even more to enhance that effect. So I'm going to set it to 2, which should, that's already working better, stopping them. We're also going to kill them pretty early, so it's going to be okay. And I'm going to set the amplitude and swirl size of this noise to 0.5 as well, just to break them up a little bit as they're in the air. But we have way too many firing now, so I'm going to reduce the amount on the random frame. The threshold I'm going to set to maybe 0.07. Let's see, and now it's kind of too random because now there's only one firing here and hit there. So let's set it to maybe 0.12. Should work a bit better. Yeah, so now we have them firing. I would actually say that's a little bit much. Maybe 0.1. You just have to experiment here. You can always change these values yourself if you find something that you think looks better. But I'm gonna go with this value for now. And I'm gonna set let's see. I'm gonna set this one. I feel like it's a bit too wide now. So let's align this and let's set the string noise. Let's drag this one further back because that will just kind of make it even sharper. It's basically the same as tightening the width, so I might just do that instead actually. Maybe 0.1 so that it's not as sharp. 0.12. And yeah, that won't be as sharp. It's a bit better. And I'm also gonna modify the life of these. So by default, there's a life expectancy of 100. If you set this to 0.5, after 12 frames, which is 0.5 of a second, 24 frames per second, they're gonna die out. But they all die very uniformly, and even if you add some life variance, say 0.2, I still find that they die in kind of a predictable fashion. They're just fading out. But if we just set these back to the default, you can control middle mouse to do that. We can actually create an attribute noise again and call it noise life. And what we can do with this this noise is we can set the life, which is deciding how long a particle will live, based on a noise. So when it dies out, it's going to die out in a more organic fashion. So I'm going to set again this to a float because life is a float, and I'm going to call the attribute float. We'll visualize it. And I kind of want a bigger element size because I want them to still die off relatively. I don't want you to see that there's like spottiness, so maybe something like 0.8. And it's important that we set this to min-max so we control the minimum life and the maximum life. And let's just try the default of 0 and 1. As you can see now, the points are randomly going to die. It's already more organic. It's kind of dying off in steps like this. But 0 and 1 is not exactly the best values. So let's set this to 0.1 as to start. And I'm going to copy this and paste a relative reference so that they're copied. And then I'm going to multiply this by how big of a difference I want between these numbers. I'm going to do 1.6 so that this one is always 1.6 times higher, the maximum life versus the minimum life. And I found the life around 0.75 is good for these strings. So what that will give us is something that looks like this. And this will also, they still kind of die out at the same time, but we are going to fade these out as they die with an alpha based on their age and also a little bit in comp. So this should work well for our case. However, I would still say that they are a little bit thick towards the end. So I'm going to set the width of them to something even smaller, maybe 0.08. Let's have a look at what this gives us. And I think this should work. I think this should work better for what we want. I think our wind is a little bit strong, maybe 0.4. And yeah, let's start with that. I don't really like this first little point coming out there, so I'm going to change the seed value here on our random frame, which should eliminate that because it'll choose random points to start. There's still some small ones, but that'll be totally fine. So I think this will be good. So now we have, if you want to use the same settings, the seed of 0.729 and the threshold of 0.1 for how often they appear. And let's do the same thing here. I'm going to set the object merge to pop ob star and then do an attribute delete where we delete everything. But this time I want to actually keep the life, I want to keep the age and the ID and the rest. Because this one we have changing point numbers, so the ID is nice to have, and also the rest that we generated will also be nice to have. And make sure it's delete non-selected, or else it's gonna delete only those ones that we actually need. And again, I'm just gonna copy the file cache I have from here, so I don't need to reset it. And I'm gonna call it cache string particles and control middle mouse on this one so that it generates a new name when I hit save to disk. And this one as well is going to be pretty quick simulations. All the simulations for this series is going to be pretty quick. There's not a lot of heavy simulations. There's just because particles are generally pretty fast to simulate, especially with no collisions or anything. And here we have it. I think it's looking pretty cool. There's some it kind of emits pretty fast here in the beginning, but I think that might be okay. Let me see. Let me try another seed frame. Actually, I'm gonna just plus 0.1, so I can. It's nice sometimes to do plus 0.1 or ×2 or something, because then you can go back to the value you had before. If I change this, I don't like it, I'll just remove that plus 0.1, and I still have access to the old value. So it's a nice way to keep track of that. And let me see, I still, even with this, it's kind of shooting nothing in the beginning, which we do want. So I'm gonna try plus 0.2, see if it gives me something in the beginning. Hopefully this time it works. Obviously any of these frames I think would work for the case. I just want to make sure that it's not too empty in the beginning. And yeah, this time I think it's working fine. So plus 0.2 will be the number that we're going to go with. Okay, so now let's set some attributes on these. The alpha, p scale, and color, like we did on the other one. And let's create a wrangle, call it set attributes again. And let's start with the p scale, which I'm going to set. It's a lot of the same things here after particle sim. I'm just going to create a channel called p scale, which I will set to, let's see, visualize them as disks, and we can lower them until we can like see that there's a little bit of separation between them. I think maybe 0.2 here will be good. We might up the particles a little bit after, but we'll see. And then let's set an alpha as well. Channel alpha, which I'm gonna set to 0.3. 0.03 is a good number there. Again, it's pretty low value, but it'll be good once we get to the rendering and shading stage, or the nuke stage. And let's also ramp in the alpha based on the noise that we have, or sorry, based on our life. So you can do that by doing alpha times equal to @nage. So nh stands for normalized age, which will be 0 at the beginning of a particle coming into life, and then 1 towards the end. So when we just do it like this, you'll see that it's multiplying it very low as it's emitting, and then it goes really high towards the end. But we want a lot more control, so let's just do a channel ramp on that. Call it ramp nage, and then a parenthesis at the end. And what we can do is we can ramp it in the beginning, so it starts low, and then at the end as well it goes low. So it's so that's kind of a smooth fade in and a smooth fade out. But you typically want to use something a bit smoother than that. So I'm going to select them all, go to B-spline, add another point, and create a curve that looks something like this. But I also don't want it to start completely from 0 and go to completely to 0. So I'm going to go with the endpoints a little bit higher, so that we get, let's see, I can go even higher, so that we get a nice effects like this, because it's okay sometimes to see them fade out. They don't need to always go completely to 0. And let's also set the color to red, so I'm just going to do the same 1, 0, 0. And now I'm also going to do something to create a little bit more breakup in this. I'm going to do an attribute noise on the position, like we did with the static sphere. So noise p, and let's see, let's just set this to p, and let's set this to 0 centered, and a lower element size and a lower amplitude. So what's this is doing is it's just breaking off the shape. This is way too much. Let's 0.05 and maybe 0.2 might be good. But let's do 0.02 for example. It might be a little small. 0.5. This is just going to break up the shape more of it. I think we need a little bit higher element size. It's kind of a subtle effect, but as it's moving through space, it'll just move a little bit and create a little bit more interesting shapes. 0.3, 0.1. We'll stick with that. If you do too much, it's going to look really bad because you'll feel it kind of swimming in the air. This I would say is a little bit much. Maybe 3.8. But it helps a little bit to break up the shape when you're further apart. Create a little bit of high frequency noise inside. And I'm also going to do an attribute blur on the position again using proximity. But this time I'm going to up the max neighbors, because if you do more blurring iterations, it's kind of clumping some points together, but I just want to get the general shape. closer, so I'm going to set this to 50, which will make it just a little bit nicer and blurred. Well, not blurred, it's going to just tighten it up, and we get these nice shapes. So let's call this, let's do a null, call it out string particles, and do the same thing here. I'm just going to copy this one so that I have the shader assignment and all that. String particles, and the only thing I'm going to change inside is where it's pointing. Let's point the object from to string particles, and let's see, let's try and render this as well. I'm going to go out a little bit here because these are quite a lot bigger, so I'm going to go in the camera, click here so that we lock the view, and go out to something like this, and let's try and render, let's find a nice one, let's maybe try and render these. So let's go to the out, copy this mantra, call it string particles mantra, and let's go here and select our string particles. And now if we render this, let's see what we get. It should already have the, it's assigned, oh, I was still rendering the core one. It should have the material assigned, and the velocity should already be working, but I'm going to turn it off just to test. So if I turn it off, let's see, might not be working, because I don't think we actually saved the velocity, so we actually need to trail it. But the render is working. I'm going to save it and click allow motion blur, and I'm going to go back here into here, and I'm going to do a trail just on this and set it to compute velocity. However, this will not, when you're emitting particles like this, you'll see the velocity breaks, but we have an ID, so we can just do match by ID, set this one also to central, and now it won't break anymore on those frames, because it's only checking backwards and forwards on the current particle, or the ID of the particle, which stays consistent per particle. And now if we render this, we should see that this one is a little bit straight in the direction of which it's going, which it is. So that is working perfectly. The only thing that I find is that it's a little bit too sparse in the particle count, so I'm going to double it. I'm just going to multiply this by 2, and I'm going to recache this. Let's set this to points so we can see it. Version up and recache it, because it's a little, you can kind of see some gaps in between them and see that it's particles and not just one solid shape. So therefore I'm going to double it. And when you do this, it's also important to, let's see, I think actually we might be hitting, oh yeah, when you do this, there's a max point limit. So I'm going to turn this off so we actually get 2 million and recache this again. But when you double the particles, you also want to lower either the alpha or the p scale. The p scale is better, just to get more detail, because it also is just going to make it twice as bright as well, but we want to keep the same brightness we already set up for the previous particles. So this should finish in just a second here, which is pretty impressive for the amount of particles. And let's see, let's visualize this as disks, and you can see that it's twice as bright now as well, but we're eliminating some of these gaps. So I'm going to set my particle scale points times 0.7 maybe. I think that should work. And if we compare on this exact same frame, save the snapshot, I'm going to render it out again. We should see that obviously when we're farther away, like this would totally work. But even if we go a little closer, now there'll be a bit more detail in here for us to make a nice render. And one more thing I'm going to do with this render is I'm going to go into the actual mantra, and I'm going to create an extra image plane called V. So this is writing out an attribute on our EXR, or an extra layer on our EXR that stores the velocity attribute, which is very useful when you're compositing, if you want to change some things after you rendered it out. But in order to do this, we actually need to save the velocity inside the material, or export it in the material. So we're going to do a bind in a material that's binding the V attribute, which is a vector. It's important you set that. And then we're going to do a bind export in here as well. Same V attribute, which is also a vector. So you just do a bind with the V and bind export with the V, which will allow our mantra to read this velocity attribute. And as you can see now, if we render this again, we will have a primary color channel, which is C, but we will also have a vector channel, which is visualizing the vector, which is the direction and the speed at which a particle is moving in a certain direction. So this I'll show how to use when we're in Nuke, but just set this up now so we can use it later. And that is all for the tendrils and this part of the tutorial series. In the next one, we're going to create the volume, which is the final simulation to create this Wanda magic effect.